It's The World This Week, 7 days. 4 Paris-based correspondents, 1 hour. The World This Week in partnership with the Daily Beast foreign editor, Christopher Dickey is with us. How are you, sir?
Glad I could make it.
Glad you're back in Paris. Huh? Glad to welcome as well news producer Ulrike Koltermann.
Guten Abend.
Busy week?
Absolutely. Yellow vest.
Yellow vest. We're about to talk about it. Hold your fire. Claire Byrne, France correspondent for the French news agency AFP. You've also been following the ubiquitous Gilets jaunes this week. We're going to be joined by Pierre Hasky, international news editor for France Inter. The World This Week on Facebook and Twitter, the hashtag World This Week. It's beginning to look a lot like Christmas, but consider it a miss for holiday shopping this coming Saturday on France's most famous high street. Paris's Champs-Élysées and the streets around it taking no chances after last Saturday's worst rioting in Paris in decades. The Eiffel Tower, the Louvre, the Opera, the Ballet will be closed. Paris Saint-Germain's home football match postponed. 8,000 riot police will be able to focus squarely on the yellow vests for whom the Macron government's climb down on Tuesday over a fuel tax is not enough.
We are facing people who are not here to protest, but to smash. And we want to have the means to not give them a free rein.
Paris is where we can make the biggest media impact. It's also where all the politicians are. And if we go knock on their doors, they can't continue to ignore us the way they can if we just stay at our roundabouts.
This is a point that you've been making, Christopher Dickey, that they're coming to Paris because otherwise they get no attention.
Well, that's right. But it's not just coming to Paris. It's coming to Paris and trashing Paris that gets them the attention. I mean, the dirty secret about this, we can talk to guys at roundabouts all day long, and they can say they disapprove of the violence, they disapprove of the casseurs, the people who come to break things, the vandals. But the truth is that the reason the government responded and the reason that we pay so much attention to them is precisely because they were burning buildings all around the Étoile. They were painting graffiti on the Arc de Triomphe. They were smashing sculptures inside. And I had several friends who were in fear for their lives because they were around the Étoile in buildings there, even as far away as Victor Hugo and other areas, quite far, way down, all the way down Avenue Kléber, all the way to overlooking the Eiffel Tower. You had cars burned one after another. That's why we're paying attention. And that's what the government can't accept. But also it's something that has to be admitted about these protesters. Because, just one more point, the people who weren't doing that were also making no effort to stop it. I was in the middle of a lot of that. And what you saw was a lot of people going, oh, that's okay. It's a sort of a spectator sport. Let's watch them burn those cars. There were not a lot of responsible Gilets jaunes who went out and said, oh, no, don't do that. That will give us a bad reputation. They loved it.
But it's not as if France doesn't know violence. I mean, the last time we had that kind of violence was in 2005. It was in the suburbs, and it was absolutely comparable. The only big difference, it's now happening in the heart of Paris.
Well, that's a very big difference.
It makes a big difference, but it's not that it's first time that people getting violent and
yeah, but it's the first time they get violent in the center of France. I mean, part of the problem with the banlieue riots of 2005 was that the people there felt wildly excluded. They were out there hours away from the center of town.
That's the same what's happening now. People who are coming to riot,
they're doing it in the
widely
center
excluded,
of town.
and they're doing it in the center of Paris. And it's just a shame that it takes so long. I mean, it's building up for weeks now, and we haven't heard anything from the president yet.
But the people who were also the people, there was a very different complexion, literally and figuratively, to the people who were rioting in 2005 and the people who are rioting now.
Claire Byrne, you traveled west to the countryside near Le Mans, the city of Le Mans. What did the yellow vests tell you there?
Yeah, so in Le Monde this week, the yellow vests, there were a couple of hundred yellow vests blocking a fuel depot, one of the biggest fuel depots in the west of France. And a small number of those had travelled to Paris last weekend and were either spectators, mainly spectators, some participants in the riots, but very many of them had stayed home, had stayed on the barricades back in the provinces. And I think, and many of them were quite angry that the images of the destruction in Paris had come to overshadow, sort of being taken to represent the whole movement. And so there was quite a lot of hostility towards the media, which they felt was kind of fueling this narrative that this is just
not toward the casseur, not toward the casseur, but toward the media, of course.
Well, yeah, certainly. You do have a point in saying that there is a certain amount of sympathy for the violence, even among the more moderates, in that they see that the violence, they feel the violence does pay, and that maybe only violence pays, particularly with Macron, who has made a point to sort of mark himself out from François Hollande, his predecessor, who was despised by the French because he was seen as weak. Macron came to power vowing, to never back down, never to get into street protests.
This Tuesday marked his first major climb down as president.
Exactly. He was going to transform France, see off the street protests. It's going to be a whole new era. But by maintaining that line, coûte que coûte, as the French say, he radicalized the movement. And I think he does have a measure of responsibility in the radicalization of the movement.
Ulrike Kotzmann, you went to Burgundy?
We went to Burgundy, and we actually had trouble finding anyone going to Paris this weekend, because people said, first of all, I cannot afford it, because those are people who barely make ends meet at the end of the month. And people said, no, it's going to be dangerous. And yeah, we heard some people saying at some point we might become violent, but those people we met, they were not really traveling to Paris. And I think what is so difficult about this movement is that there are no representatives. I mean, even at the same roundabout where we spent some time, there were people from the far left, from the far right. There were ecological people. I mean, there were all sorts of people, and everyone had a different set of demands. So it's very difficult, and they don't want to be represented.
How are you received as journalists? Because we're seeing reports that there's been a lot of hostility and Facebook-fueled anger.
I think we were lucky because we are foreign TV, so they were very nice with us. So they appreciated that foreign media was interested, but they also told us all sorts of complot theories. So there's definitely a problem with
conspiracy
fake news.
theories.
Conspiracy theories, absolutely.
Did you get conspiracy theories as well?
Plenty of conspiracy theories, including this theory that was doing the rounds on social media, in which the far right has tried to sort of insinuate into this whole movement about migration, about this migration agreement that France is due to sign on Monday. A voluntary accord about, better treatment of migrants, and which is being sold on social media by the far right as France selling the country out to the UN, selling its sovereignty, and it's going to be awash with migrants. So there was, some of these theories were being put about. But there were still very many rational people making what really sound like quite legitimate, points about inequality, about what they see as the extravagance of the president, whether it's on his set of bone china or a new €300,000 carpet that he's reportedly bought for the Elysee, and, their everyday life, when they're struggling to reach the end of the month. And one thing many people said, many parents said, is they couldn't remember the last time they had bought a treat for their kids, taken them to the cinema. Some had never brought their children who were 6, 7, 8 to the cinema. It's just too expensive. And these are not the poorest of the poor. These are sort of lower middle class France. And this is the reality.
This was the week where we learned that France had leapfrogged Denmark as the OECD nation that gets the most of its revenue from taxes. 46.2% in 2017. That's according to that Paris-based organization, compared to 52% in 2013. When you look at those numbers, there is a caveat to that, which is there's still a social contract in France, and you get something for those taxes.
Well, you get a lot for your taxes in France, but you also pay a lot of taxes in France. And there used to be a tremendous contrast, for instance, with the United States, where you also pay a fair amount of taxes and you feel like you don't get a goddamn thing for it. Especially you don't get medical care, you don't get all the kinds of social welfare systems that you get here. One of the things that you see, though, with the Gilets jaunes is they're complaining about taxes, and then the next thing you know, they're complaining that they don't have enough services. So
then again, I mean, the tax that really was the last straw was a tax on gas, and that really makes a difference
diesel.
because it's about cars, and the people in the countryside, they don't have
I
any
understand that,
alternatives
but
to cars.
first of all, a couple of things. First of all, the vast majority of the population of this country doesn't live in the countryside. They live in the cities. Secondly, it is a huge burden for them to pay that extra tax, and this was an incredibly badly presented program by Macron. The Economist says, a lot of this was a problem of communications on the part of Macron.
And it's not even true
And
to
he
call it
still
an
hasn't
exit
figured
tax.
it out.
We can welcome Pierre Aski.
Thank you, sorry.
Paris traffic couldn't
Paris
keep you up.
traffic with a lot of police going up and down across the city.
You weren't kidnapped by the Gilets
I was
jaunes?
stuck in a traffic jam.
Well, your thoughts at this sort of siege mentality we're witnessing it on the eve of Act 4 is what the demonstrators call
Well,
it.
last Saturday was really a traumatic day, and I think everybody's playing now with these images, whether it's the government who wants to dramatize and prevent people from coming, or some of the Gilets jaunes who are playing the moderate or the extremist. I mean, it's become a big theater with a very serious play, but everybody's playing a part in this game. And frankly, we don't know. Maybe tomorrow is going to be the quietest day of the year because everything is going to be closed.
Every metro station is closed. They can't even move.
And everybody's staying inside, looking at television and not going out. I mean, that's really the message I hear from everybody I know. So we don't know.
All right, the Yellow Vests movement has breathed new life into a high school student movement, which had been listless until last Saturday. The protests against education reform taking a violent turn in the Paris working-class suburb of Mantes-la-Jolie Thursday, many expressing shock over images of riot police lining up the pupils arrested. The education minister says he understands the indignation, but adds that there's two sides to the story.
Students can be angry and protest, but that doesn't give them the right to burn down cars. In several areas in France, people were locked up in their vehicles, with protesters threatening to burn them alive. People could have died. An education official was covered in gasoline. Would you like us to do nothing?
Your reaction to that, Pierre Aski?
The images are indeed shocking, and I think the police is really on the edge and has gone beyond the edge very often in the past couple of weeks. On the other side, we've reached a level of violence in this period which is unprecedented. This morning there was a reporter in northern France who was thrown acid at her by school kids. And here, according to the minister, these youngsters, among whom there were non-school kids, but people from outside, were throwing gas canisters in a barricade that was set in flames. So there is a context which is...
Why is it so violent? Why the violence?
I think because we've reached a point where... on one side, you have a government incarnated by Macron who has personified the anger through arrogance, through a number of provocative statements like you just have to cross the street to find a job and these kind of things, which have been the focus of all this anger. And on the other side, there's been one drop too many. Maybe it was the price of gas that brought out all the grievances that you have in this country, and which are, and I think that's why you get 80% of the people supporting this movement, which are quite legitimate in the sense that the inequalities and the territorial divide are things that have been written about by sociologues and demographs and geographers for years, and so we know this is a reality.
Claire Byrne.
A sort of a related point and something that sort of struck me throughout these protests is I think it's interesting to see how the Fifth Republic, the two-round presidential election system, which we kind of saw as having perhaps saved us from a Trump-style scenario, is seen as a good sort of backstop. The limits of that, because what we've seen now with Emmanuel Macron, with François Hollande, is that they're elected as sort of default candidates, as sort of elected as the alternative to an even less popular figure. And Macron's really, his support can best be measured by his first round score, which was 24%. So you have a president who's elected with 24% of the popular vote, really, in the first round. That's a proper measure of his support. And
But the French like their system.
But increasingly, we're seeing their legitimacy being called into question.
But what about the National Assembly?
I agree.
I mean, come on, Claire.
You
can talk 24%, but he blew out the National Assembly.
I'm not questioning his legitimacy myself, but I'm saying that this is something you keep coming up against among the protesters, and it's the whole sort of dichotomy in France. When it came to the National Assembly, they said, let's give Macron a big majority so he can implement his program. They gave him all the power, all the levers, but at the same time and time again, they'll say, well, he doesn't really represent a majority of the French people, and his legitimacy is fragile.
But what's going? Go ahead.
Yeah, I see there's some irony because Macron's movement En Marche was all about listening, all about grassroots, and the situation was nearly the same. People were upset. There was disgust with the political elite. All this was already there during his election campaign, and this is how he.
And an Oxford poll out on
office.
Thursday says that none of the other opposition leaders have benefited from this movement, even the far right and the far left.
If you hear, Daniel Cohn-Bendit, who was the leader of May 68, so he knows something about mass movements, and who supported Emmanuel Macron during the election, said something this week which I think is very right. He said Macron made the right diagnosis on the society, on what's wrong with his society, but he failed to find and to explain and to show the reality of what he's been doing by his personal arrogance, by his vertical line of power.
He failed, past tense. It's over.
Whatever happens, and frankly, I hope we don't go into an institutional crisis and we don't go into a collapse of the institutions, which would be very dramatic. Whatever happens, he will not recover his political authority. I don't see how that is possible.
I think there are a couple of problems. First of all, that aloofness, that arrogance, it's very Obama-like in that sense. I mean, he really took the wrong lessons from Obama on that. But also, in a French context, I mean, really, some of his language really did sound a lot like "let them eat brioche," let them eat cake.
Too arrogant. Okay, something to think about for the president who needs an image makeover, says Christopher Dickey. When we come back, we're going to be taking a look at the political fortunes of the leader across the Rhine. They're looking up this Friday. Stay with us. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's The World This Week. The World This Week in partnership with The Daily Beast. Foreign editor Christopher Dickey is with us, as is Ulrike Kolterman, news producer. How are you? Welcome back. Welcome back as well to Claire Byrne, who is safely back in the capital as well after going to the provinces, France correspondent for the French news agency AFP, and Pierre Aski, international news editor at flagship public radio station France Inter. We were talking about the fortunes of the French president. It's been a much better week for Angela Merkel, or a much better Friday at least. The Christian Democrats electing her protégée, Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, to head the party, AKK as she's known, pipping the more conservative Friedrich Merz with a little less than 52% of the vote in the second round of balloting at a CDU conference in Hamburg.
I accept the result of the vote, and I thank you for your trust. And I would like to especially cordially thank Jens Spahn and Friedrich Merz for the fair contest we had.
Ulrike Kollermann, she also said, we must have the courage to stay the course against the zeitgeist. What does she mean by that?
I think she means that she stands for her own, and she is not only a copy of Merkel or mini Merkel, how she was dubbed in media. She actually said also in her first speech that she is a mother of three who knows how to combine career and family, and she has learned guiding for 18 years. So she was on the political front, and she has got some expertise, which is good news.
So a good Friday for Merkel, because this is her
absolutely
and
because
successor.
She was her candidate. Merkel did not really support her officially during the campaign, but everyone knew that she is her candidate, and it's good news for the party because the two women can work together. And the other candidate, Merz, is an old rival, and he was pushed aside by Merkel years ago. So it would have been
a thin margin, though, 30 votes. 30 votes, the difference.
Yeah, but then it's a deal.
All right.
She's elected.
And what's the perfect boss to give your boss of 18 years? I forgot to say, your German boss of 18 years. The Christian Democrats offering Angela Merkel Kent Negato's baton used to conduct the Hamburg State Opera's rendition of Beethoven's Ode to Joy at last year's G20 summit. I don't know how that compares to a gold watch, Ulrike Kollermann. Merkel staying on as chancellor, she says, until the end of her mandate.
Well, she sort of looks relieved that they had an acceptable idea for a farewell gift. And it's not a really farewell gift because she stays on as a chancellor, and she said she wants to stay on until 21. And it looks very much as if she's preparing her departure in an elegant way, which many male politicians have problems to do.
So on the one hand, we have the cover of this week's Economist, which has the riots in France and big alarm bells going off. On the other, Merkel staying on. Is it a good or a bad week for Europe?
Tell us, Claire.
Well, possibly if it's good for Germany, you'd have to say it's good for Europe. That might outweigh. But France's troubles being so deep, I think perhaps a bad week for Europe and the whole. But I do think it's interesting that Germany sort of repeatedly votes for continuity and experience. Whereas in France, we just voted, in the last election, 2017, for a new man with a new party to tear it all up. And we're here. It's not a direct cause and effect relationship. There are other factors, but last year, after the elections in Germany, people were talking about Merkel in Germany as suddenly a bit of a weak link, in the Franco-German motor, and the power had sort of the dynamics had shifted to Macron, and he was driving a change. And now, who's looking like the weaker link in the couple? It's France again. So that was kind of a brief reprieve, really, for France in that sort of power dynamic.
Piaski.
There was you were talking about the cover of The Economist. The Economist had an incredible cover only a few months ago where you had Merkel in the background, in the shadow, and Macron was in the spotlight. And he had become the strong man of the couple. And
that was after the cover where he was walking on water, right?
Yes, yes. So don't think cover stories are durable in Europe today.
But is Merkel a lame duck chancellor?
No, she's not, because I don't think that's her temper. But she's not out of trouble because her coalition is very weak. Particularly due to the almost collapse of the Social Democrats. I was in Germany last week, and I was in a meeting in a conference and surrounded by a lot of young Social Democrats, and I asked them, "Do you think the SPD should stay in the coalition?" And there was an outcry. All of them said, "No, we should leave." And they said, "But we don't know if our leadership will agree to leave." But they thought that the party should really leave for its own sake to revive in opposition. And so that's going to be the main focus of the next few months. The European elections, now it's probably going to be stable until the European elections. But if the SPD falls again and the Greens are shining in Germany, we might get to a point.
I was going to say, we've got something like 3 regional elections coming up before those European elections, which take place in the spring. What happens to Merkel if the CDU falters at all those hurdles?
Well, she's definitely not in a very strong position. I mean, the AfD is now in all regional parliaments in Germany, and it's the main opposition party. So, but if Merkel is not the party leader anymore, that even gives her some more liberty to be a chancellor. And with Kramp-Karrenbauer as a party leader, she can work in tandem. And Kramp-Karrenbauer also stands for the more centrist CDU. If it had been Merz, he announced that he wanted to get half of the votes of AfD, but that would have meant strengthen the right wing, the conservative wing of CDU, which is even more tricky if you're in a coalition with the left. So I think it's still a good compromise.
Still a good compromise. Before the CDU conference, Angela Merkel earlier in the week was in Washington at George H.W. Bush's funeral. A reminder that the 41st President of the United States was in charge when the Berlin Wall fell and Germany was reunited. When we look at the images from the funeral, Christopher Dickey, the seeing Merkel shaking hands with Barack Obama, here with Joe Biden, what went through your head at that moment?
I didn't watch it. Actually, I didn't watch it. So much of the coverage of the funeral was just constant on American television. Whenever I tuned into it, was always George H.W. Bush. But I think, certainly there is a desire now, particularly in Europe, there is a wish, a fantasy, that you could have an American president like George H.W. Bush, who understood what Europe was about, who understood what was going on when the wall collapsed, who played it very, very well, working with European leaders. I mean, think of the chaos that we were on the brink of in 1989. I mean, it was just one country after another undergoing often violent and revolutionary change. And somehow Europe came out of that after a couple of years, with the exception of Yugoslavia. Somehow Europe came out of that after a couple of years as a very stable continent. And George H.W. Bush played a major role making that happen.
Last Saturday, Donald Trump seemed ready to bury the hatchet with China's president. They had dinner together on the sidelines of the G20 in Buenos Aires. Trump since reminded us over Twitter that he's a tariff man, and markets have been spooked by news that the CFO of telecoms giant Huawei had been arrested in Canada. Meng Wanzhou, daughter of the mobile company's founder, set for extradition to the United States, reportedly over Iran sanctions violations. Canada's prime minister insists justice is blind. This isn't a politically motivated arrest. Try telling the Chinese, though.
The U.S. has imposed restrictions on Huawei for long. Huawei has a more solid foundation in domestic markets, so I don't think it has a big impact on Huawei in China. But it may affect Huawei's business in the international market.
China's economy is getting stronger, and I think the US are unhappy about that. So they've done something to harm China's interest, which I guess is related to the arrest.
Pierre Haski, what do you make of this arrest, which sent markets tumbling?
It's a very serious crisis because we're not dealing with anyone. Huawei is the golden symbol of China's revival. It's what China wants to be. It's the top technological company,
and it does have narrow ties to the military. It rose up thanks
to the father of Miss Meng, who was arrested, was himself a military man, and that's where Huawei finds its foundations. And so, although she's being arrested on Iran charges, apparently. The war is about mastering the technology, and the U.S. want to prevent China from, its containment, to use an old Cold War phrase. So you have now the U.S., Australia, New Zealand, and now Japan, who have banned Huawei from selling their products in the market. And Huawei is supposed to be the number one equipment provider for the 5G, which is the new generation of technology in mobile phones. So we are, I think, at a crossroads when the world is going to be divided in an American technology world and a Chinese technology world, and the interaction is going to be more and more difficult, and that's really not very good news for the world.
Yeah, and a separate development, as you were saying, Pierre, how Huawei expressing surprise and disappointment after a senior European Union official warned Beijing's intelligence service might gain access to their phones. There's also BT, which has confirmed it's removing Huawei equipment from key areas of its 4G network after concerns were raised about the Chinese firm's presence in critical telecoms infrastructures. And now this word that Japan as well is having serious misgivings, Christopher Dickey. The Japanese, which plans to ban government use of Huawei products.
Well, there's a lot of suspicion, and there's, I think, a lot of propaganda about that for the reasons that Pierre was talking about. I haven't seen a lot of substantiation of what Huawei is supposedly doing that is so dangerous in all these contexts. But I did buy my granddaughter a Huawei phone to use when she's here, and I think I'm going to put it in a lead envelope now. But I think there's another issue, and I would always defer to Pierre on this, and it's central to the whole tariff war with the United States and to this issue, and that is intellectual property. There is this deep-seated feeling and record in the United States of accusing China of stealing intellectual property from the United States, basically spying on the United States, spying on U.S. corporations, taking the intellectual property, and then starting to manufacture in China. And as a result, not only are Americans not making money, but they're being pushed out of markets. And that is more important even than the tariff issues.
And there's one more disturbing aspect in the story that it was a coincidence that on the one hand, she was arrested, and on the other hand, Trump was having dinner with his Chinese partner and saying we are on the brink of a new relationship and everything is going fine. So what does that mean? Does it mean that Trump is not even briefed by his people? So
John Bolton admitted he knew when the dinner took place that this was going to happen. So
yeah, but what about Trump then?
So no, but it means that they're trying to play on both counts, and probably they feel that China needs the respite on the trade war enough to accept to disconnect both
either
issues.
that or this is the Americans doing hostage taking in order to promote their
But the Chinese could take hostages themselves because the number of American executives who are in China is quite high too.
Well, let's watch that space.
Is this going to force a bigger rethink of China's brand of capitalism? Last week we had the now former head of Alibaba, Jack Ma, saying, yes, it's an open secret, but he admitted
a member of the
Communist Party. This tight relationship, this top-down type of capitalism, are Western companies, are Western powers going to have a real rethink of how they do business with China?
This has started the day Xi Jinping took over. He has re-centralized power around the Communist Party, and there's no private sector in China that can be completely independent from the Communist Party, and Jack Ma is now become the symbol of that, because he's the richest man, the most successful businessman in China, and he has to be a member of the Communist Party if he wants to do business. So yes, there is rethink. We have this rethink on all counts. For example, on Chinese investments in Europe, Germany is actually leading the way in protecting its technological companies from takeover from China. And now we have these big Chinese companies like Huawei who find walls to their expansion in the key markets in the West.
We promised Christopher Dickey, because he was pining for it, that we would talk about Brexit before we left. Not the most auspicious prelude to the UK Parliament's most consequential vote in decades. The House of Commons this past week voting down the government 3 times in the same day. One of those votes, an unprecedented censure, forcing Theresa May to hand over legal advice over Brexit, another sponsored by a conservative pro-Remain MP that gives power back to the Commons. Should there be a no vote next Tuesday, and there probably will be if you look at those votes from this week. The pro-Brexit Daily Telegraph already asking, what now, Prime Minister? Claire Byrne.
I don't know what now, Daily Telegraph. I believe that there are 6 possible outcomes of her losing that vote, as she probably will, which range from, go back, try and get something more from Brussels, and that she can go back and hold a second vote on. Brussels unlikely to give her very much, just some vague assurances about how the backstop will be implemented. She holds a second vote. If that doesn't work, then, could be new elections, could be a new referendum, could be so many 6 different outcomes.
Because a week ago we were saying how fast fortunes flip, and we were just talking about it in relation to Merkel and Macron. Last week we were saying, here's Theresa May. She's stared down the hard right inside her own party. We've been underestimating her. She's got the staying power.
We still may be underestimating her. I mean, she's still, so she's going to lose this first vote. We'll wait and see by how much by. But she's kind of changing. She came back from Brussels and says it's this deal or no deal. And now she's kind of saying, okay, it's this deal or perhaps no Brexit at all. Do you really want that? Brexiteers. And, if she kind of plays that line and takes it to the brink in March, they might have cause to rethink and she might squeak it through. So.
All right. When in doubt, though, do like the British. Head to the bookmakers. They give 8-1 odds of May's divorce deal passing next Tuesday. They're also taking wagers over what happens afterwards.
1-8 that it won't go through. So what we're saying is that it's around an 18% chance that Theresa May will manage to get this through. And pretty worryingly also is that if it doesn't go through the first time, we don't think it will get through at all, even later on in March.
Even later on in March. And so they're saying 60% chance of a second referendum, Ulrike.
I think it's a good idea because no one knows if this deal really reflects the people's will. So why not ask them? I think it's the best option they have because when they answered in 2016, they didn't know about the circumstances. And now we know what it means. So just ask them again, is it that what you want? Sure, it's very dangerous because you cannot ask the same question again. And if you have a threefold question, then it's even more tricky. But I think it's the only way out.
A second referendum, the only way to go?
It's interesting that all of a sudden we're talking of a no Brexit. I mean, this was out of the picture for the past 2 years. Nobody was even considering this as a serious option. And
Brexit
suddenly it's back on the table. And so whether it's through a second referendum or through I don't know what mystery of politics can provide. I would support that. I would be very happy if we forget about the past 2 years, you come back home and we're good friends again.
Is this great news, Chris? This story is going to run longer now.
Yeah, and you know how I love this story. Look, 2 things. First of all, Brexit was always an incredibly stupid idea. It was stupid of Cameron to hold the referendum in the first place. It was incredibly stupid of the British people to vote for it. And it's a bad deal any way you cut it. They wind up having to follow the rules and pay a lot of the money for the European Union. They get no voice in what the European Union does. But there's another side to the question. Why on earth would the European Union want them back? The British have always screwed up the European Union every chance they could get. They pulled their weight. They said, we're doing this, but you've got to do it our way. And we're not going to be part of the Eurozone. And we're not going to do this. And we're not going to do that.
There's one reason.
Why?
German cars.
To show that you cannot leave the European Union. And that politically is an important signal.
We'll have to leave it there for now. Pierre Aski, Ulrike Kohlerman, Claire Byrne, Christopher Dickey. Stay with us. Media Watch is next. We say hello to Nicholas Rushworth.
Thank you, François. Hi, everybody.
Hi.
I'm going to talk about the Yellow Vest movement.
Okay.
The online, they're saying that it's kind of like a Black Saturday with this anxiety and uncertainty about spillover, unrest.
Because we were saying earlier, nobody knows what's going to happen Saturday.
Absolutely, no one knows. The uncertainty there is definitely a kind of crippling factor, if you like. We've looked, I think, at The Economist with its headline, Macron's Nightmare. Last year, The Economist saying, France, country of the year. Now, there was even a picture in The Economist of him walking on water. I don't know if you remember that one. Let's go to Frankfurter Allgemeine, which has got a fantastic picture of a very miserable Macron, splattered in yellow.
With 5 o'clock shadow.
Absolutely. And the grimace is like, what am I going to do here? Der Aufstand is the riot, so the uprising, and the paper saying he's failing. The fact that he actually backtracked on the fuel tax increase means his whole reform program is in doubt. Let's just go to the same magazine here, Frankfurter Allgemeine. In May, what do we have? We have the Jupiter god, Europe's new leader, and he is going to be a savior for Europe. I mean, absolutely extraordinary fall from grace. La Tribune de Genève in neighbouring Switzerland has him in its cartoon depicted as Jupiter. He speaks in French, saying, well, does anyone speak Gallic, Gaulois? And of course, Edouard Philippe, there, the Prime Minister, is looking at a placard there saying, I looked at it for a few minutes. I said, it's not actually saying anything. It is gobbledygook.
Right.
This is the language of, they don't speak the same language. It's pure dialogue of the deaf. So that's a Swiss...
That's the Swiss take on it.
Absolutely. So
right.
Macron in trouble. And what we've got is a whole mass of disinformation. We've heard the word, a Facebook revolution going on in France with these yellow vest protests. On Facebook in the last few hours, we've got this yellow vest listing about 20 demands. And I looked at it, and number one, raise, we're going to have 40% more minimum wage. We're going to have 20%, 25% maximum income tax. Number three, again, completely unrealistic, more civil servants. Number 9, Frexit. So you've got a mishmash of crazy ideas, and of course it's all bunk. Libération journalist Vincent Glad saying, here we've got a new list of demands. Nothing official about this official charter at all. It's on Facebook. And Frexit, would you want to believe that or not? Absolutely extraordinary. So the disinformation. Yellow Vest representatives are meeting Edouard Philippe this Friday evening in a bid to perhaps head off some of the tension that we're fearing. The hit for Macron, he's now down to, with a YouGov, 18%. That poll, the 28th, 29th of November. But what struck me, actually, when you look at this rating for him, if you look more closely, you've got 18% for Macron. And if we scroll down, who is number one? 19%, but Marine Le Pen. Mélenchon at 15%. So the extremes of French political life are gaining there quite clearly, just in terms of that YouGov poll. One of the analysis pieces that I really loved over the last few days is by Nathalie Noguered. She's the former managing director of Le Monde. She's saying, we've got here Matteo Salvini in the wings, Viktor Orban in the wings. The populist movement are going to gain from what's happening now. The whole of France is in danger. We've got the European elections in May. You have this whole question of just will those populists creep in and take advantage of the mess that Macron is facing.
All right, many thanks for that, Nicholas Rushworth. Of course, we'll have coverage here on France 24. I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you for joining us here in The World This Week.